Episode 9. There are very few things in life as satisfying as 9 holes of golf. It's also the Masters this week, so considering everything happening around us, it's a pretty good week. The number 9 is also my lucky number. I was born on July 9th. Not too much medical here, but for those of you dealing with penetrating trauma, some trivia. In the year 2000 in Queens, New York, 50 Cent was shot 9 times. Oh my goodness, Beyond MD, Episode 9. Welcome everyone to Episode 9 of the Beyond MD podcast. So today we're going to take a step back from the allure of Bitcoin and go back to basics. We're talking pension plans. Today's interview is with Jean-Pierre Laporte, who is CEO of Integris Pension Management Corp. But before that, I'd like to hit on a few points. So healthcare professionals, including doctors, have many sources of stress, one of which can be finances, and many reasons for that. Lengthy training, pricey training, starting to earn later than many others. And so healthcare professionals, including physicians for years, have been sounding the alarm bell, and some have even been asking for pensions. Well, it turns out that pension plans are possible. Now, let's be clear, this is not a pension where the government or the hospital is going to be contributing to your retirement, but you can create a pension plan through your corporation if you have been paying yourself salary. So today's topic and the next episode, we're going to be talking about the IPP and the PPP. Now, I don't like acronyms, so the IPP is the individual pension plan, and the PPP for next episode is the personal pension plan. So what we should be asking ourselves as we go through these episodes is, while the RRSP is great, and listen, I'm not here to bash the RRSP, but we should be asking ourselves that as incorporated professionals, can we be doing better than the RRSP? I think it's possible. So let's quickly recap the RRSP. It's a simple defined contribution plan where you're allowed to contribute up to 18% of salary to a maximum of last year's money purchase limit. So for 2022, you're going to be able to put in $29,210 personally into the RRSP. And for that, you have to pay yourself around $162,000 in salary. And that's it. Basically, you get a personal tax deduction for that. Now, the pension plans should be thought of as an RRSP for your corporation, but typically with greater contribution room. So basically, contributions from the corporation into the pension are a tax deduction for the corporation. Money inside the pension is going to grow tax sheltered similar to an RRSP. As we'll see in the interview, there are some other tax advantages to these pension plans, and they are a workaround for the passive income rules. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that pensions are not a DIY project. And listen, I know a lot of us love DIY. I, in fact, am obsessed with DIY. I talk about it so much that my wife has officially banned any major DIY projects inside the house. Now, the front yard and the backyard, that's my DIY oasis. So personal accomplishments in the pandemic, I was able to assemble by myself a spring-free trampoline for my kids, as well as a play set that I ordered, a solid cedar wood. Very proud of that. Now, the garden was a bit of a different story. I was out in the front yard one day, just going at the front garden, trying everything possible to keep up with everybody else. And then one of my neighbors, she rolls by, stops a car, pulls down the window, and she says, "Oh, look, you are just so cute, putting in so much effort into this garden." And I know she's looking at the garden and she's like, "This is a piece of shit." But in my mind, I'm just like, what? Like, listen, I'm not going for cute here. I am, in fact, going for lawn of the year. Anyways, last year, the garden was a total shit show. This year is going to be better. But back to DIY. DIY is okay. A lot of us do it for our investments through ETFs, even individual stocks. Nothing wrong with that. But pensions are different. This is not a situation where you're going to pick up the phone, call your bank or your accountant and be like, "Hey, I feel like opening up a pension plan today." They are certainly more complex, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't learn about them. So for the interview today, we have a true expert in the pension space. Happy to have Jean-Pierre Laporte, who by training is a pension lawyer specializing in employee benefits and retirement plans. Up until 2012, he was practicing out of the Toronto office of Bennett Jones, which is a Canadian leading business law firm. After that, he took over as CEO of Integris Pension Management Corp, where he is today. And Integris provides pension plans to incorporated professionals and small business owners. Jean-Pierre has written a number of prominent papers on pension reform and administration, including the seminal concept paper on the Supplemental Canada Pension Plan, and then the review of individual pension plans for the Canadian Tax Journal. He's often appeared as an expert witness before standing committees of the House of Commons, and for all his hard work on improving pension security for Canadians, Jean-Pierre was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal by His Excellency, the Governor General of Canada. And with that, here's my interview with Jean-Pierre Laporte. All right, Jean-Pierre, welcome to the podcast. Where does the podcast find you?
I'm here in beautiful Etobicoke at the head office of Integris Pension Management Corporation.
Very good, very good. So, Jean-Pierre, before we dive into the questions, I'd love to hear a little bit about you. And I know that every time I look up pensions for professionals, your name seems to come up. So you seem to be a man with a mission behind this. But tell us about yourself and why pensions are important to you.
Sure. Well, I was a Bay Street pension lawyer that did not have access to a company pension plan. So it's a typical case of the shoemaker, whose kids run around barefoot. And so I started researching how professionals that are incorporated might be able to offer themselves a true pension plan, something that mimics the Healthcare of Ontario pension plan or the Teachers pension plan. These are plans that I greatly admired as a pension lawyer. So I discovered the individual pension plan one day doing some research, and I must say it has changed the course of my life.
That's a powerful statement. So we're going to dive into that. I'm really excited to learn more. So let's start with the better known animal of the two. So the individual pension plan, so the IPP. So maybe just give us a little quick nutshell history of the IPP. How long has it been around for?
Well, it's the rules that codifies the IPP can be traced back to 1991 in income tax regulations. So we're now in the 30th year of IPPs.
From my understanding is it's a defined benefit plan, but for our audience, can you just summarize what a defined benefit plan is?
So a defined benefit plan promises a fixed regular pension in retirement, much like an annuity. So you have to use a formula. And the formula that's used in the pension plan fixes the regular amount. And the typical formula is 2% of your pensionable salary multiplied by the number of years of credited service, meaning the years that you're participating into the plan. Now, this 2% is what we call the discount rate. It's just a fancy way of measuring how generous the pension plan is. Many of the private sector plans offer a 1.5% formula, but virtually all of the government plans, like HOOP and Teachers, offer a 2% discount rate. So you know how much money you're going to get in retirement because there's a formula that tells you. What you don't know, the tough part, is calculating how much money you must contribute now and in the future to ensure that by the time it's time to retire, there's enough money sitting inside the pension plan to sustain this future stream of promised pension amounts. And that's where an actuary comes in and makes predictions as to what you should be contributing now in order to ensure that there's sufficient cash by retirement and throughout retirement, not just up to the point of retirement.
So as it pertains to professionals and small business owners, my understanding is that if we want to enroll in an IPP, then we essentially have to be incorporated, right?
In 99% of the time, there's a professional corporation or a regular corporation that pays salaries, and that's the sponsor, yes.
For those of us who are incorporated and who are contemplating enrolling in an IPP, should we have been paying ourselves salary? What about the people who have been paying themselves dividends up until this point? That's one thing I wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Unfortunately, dividend income is a right as a shareholder, not as an employee. And because an IPP is an employment pension plan, dividend income does not qualify.
That is good to know. Okay, I think maybe a take-home point, because I can tell you a quick story from 2018. I was finishing my second year of practice, and one of my colleagues, we were chatting at the hospital, and she told me, she's like, Yatin, you are paying yourself salary from the corporation, right? And I said, yeah, well, why? What's the big deal? And she said, well, listen, like, you want to remain eligible for an individual pension plan when the time comes. And I had no idea. I had said, like, first of all, what is that? And then she just pulled out her documents. It was just like assets obtained through the RRSP. And then she pulled out the individual pension plan, which absolutely destroyed the RRSP. So for me, that was my first foray into this. And that's when I started to learn about it. But I think that's a good take-home point, that it's salary.
Well, salary and bonuses, T4. Anything that's T4.
Gotcha. Okay, Jean-Pierre, maybe just tell us a little bit about the ideal candidate for an IPP. Who would this be?
Well, for an IPP, typically you have to be over the age of 40 for it to make sense, because you're penalized in terms of how much you can contribute to an IPP if you're under the age of 40. We don't have that problem with the personal pension plan, the PPP, which is, we'll talk about later, but for an IPP, 40 plus is the threshold.
So for anybody under the age of 40, it's just not worth thinking about because the contributions you're going to be able to make are generally going to be a bit less than what you could into an RRSP before 40. Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah, that's right. So in fact, it gets worse and worse the younger you are.
Okay.
So if you were really young, let's say fresh out of medical school, and I don't know what age that would be, but depending on your specialty, but
it's not young. Yeah.
Well, let's say it's around what 28, 30 or
Let's
something.
say early 30s, yeah. For the 5-year residencies, yeah, let's say 30.
Yeah, so there'd be thousands of dollars of difference. You'd be able to put a lot more in an RSP or in a personal pension plan than an IPP.
Okay, so now let's start to get into some of the tax sheltering opportunities afforded by the individual pension plan. And maybe let's start off by talking about the passive income rules that were introduced a few years ago. Obviously, if the corporation has too much passive income, then that can affect eligibility for the small business tax rate. Maybe talk us through a little bit about this in a nutshell and why pension plans become important in this context.
Yeah, sure. So the standard advice that many doctors, and not just doctors, a lot of incorporated professionals or even business owners got, usually from their accountant, but sometimes from their financial planner, was the following. Incorporate, pay the low corporate tax rate inside of your PC, on the first $500,000. And then if you don't need to pull money out to live, then invest that corporate income, these retained earnings, invest them in a non-registered corporate investment account, or maybe buy some permanent life insurance. So that was the standard advice, and many, many people followed that. Mm-hmm. Some people went to the extreme, and unlike you, they didn't even take any salary. They did all dividends. Whatever they needed to pull out to pay their mortgage or put their kids through private school was done through dividends. Now, the problem is this strategy, this mantra, was put in the crosshairs of the federal government in 2017. And they came out with a white paper that said the professional class is abusing the tax system because they're using the small business rules to defer having to pay their fair share of tax. And so they brought in a whole slew of tax reforms. Some of them were extremely draconian. Most of these got abandoned, but two key ones survived and got passed into legislation. And the acronyms are TOSI and TOPI. So I'm not going to talk about TOSI, that's the tax on split income, but I will focus on TOPI, the tax on passive investments, because that's what you were asking me about. Mm-hmm. So TOPI is the concept that if your corporation spits out more than $50,000 of passive income, and when I say your corporation, it could also be an associated company, not just the active operating company. So if you've got more than $50,000 of passive income that's being generated, for every additional dollar of passive income that you've earned, you lose 5 of your $500,000 small business allowance. Mm-hmm. So your corporate tax rate jumps from 12.2% to 26.5%. So it's a massive, massive tax increase just because you're earning too much passive income inside of a corporate vehicle. How does the IPP and, of course, the PPP help? Well, when you contribute assets, those retained earnings, or even pre-tax dollars, they're not just retained earnings, they're pre-tax dollars that have never been taxed. When you contribute those to the pension plan, they come off the balance sheet. So they're no longer caught by the TOPI rules. That's the key. That's how you can sidestep a lot of these measures.
All right, so that sounds like a very useful workaround. Now, my understanding is that after the age of 40, you can make greater contributions from your corporation into an IPP than compared to personal contributions into an RRSP, and that this difference will increase with time. But I'm just wondering if you can shed some light on what the difference in contributions is. Maybe you can just give us some ballpark numbers.
Sure. So for fun, we've actually calculated this. We took the maximum RRSP contribution from the year 1990 to the year 2020, and we tallied them up. Okay, so best case scenario, if you always earn the maximum salary to maximize your RSP, how much would you been able to contribute? Not to have that money grow, just to contribute. Well, it's about $550,000. Okay, so that's not bad. That's over $500,000 of tax assistance. With an IPP and even more with a PPP, you can double or triple that. Okay, so if you like tax assistance, if you like getting a fat refund check from the government, well, how about doubling or tripling what you're getting from your RSP right now? That's the bottom line.
Okay, that's a big difference. And I guess everything that you contribute to the IPP from the corporation, that creates a deduction on taxable income for the corp, right?
Yeah, of course. Think of it as an RSP for the corporation with triple the limit.
Let's talk a bit more about funding the IPP. So we talked about putting in money from the corporation. Now, what if somebody is 40, they have a solid RRSP up until that point? Can that be rolled into the IPP?
Yeah. There's usually two different ways in which RSP assets can be rolled into an IPP. The most well-known one is called the qualifying transfer. So that's when, if you were getting a salary from your corporation, from your PC over the years, when you do set up the IPP, you're allowed to recognize past service. All those years that you were collecting a salary now can be used to calculate a past service buyback amount. And CRA doesn't allow you typically to fund all of that from corporate sources. A chunk of the total cost has to come from personal sources like an RSP.
I see.
And so you end up rolling all or a portion of your existing RRSPs into the IPP under these qualifying transfer rules. The balance is made up with PC money that's tax deductible to the PC.
I see. So let's just say if somebody is, 48 years of age, and they could have started the IPP when they were 40, but they started at 48. So for those 8 years where they were providing service, they still can't play catch up with their corporate funds, right?
Yeah. We've had a 71-year-old client who had never contributed to the RRSP, and at the last minute had received salaries his whole life. The last minute decided to buy back 28 years of past service.
Jean-Pierre, maybe you can touch on terminal funding, given that we're talking about funding, because it's a term I hear about, but one that I just want to clarify.
Sure, yeah. So terminal funding is an amazing corporate tax deduction that's only available when you decide to turn on the pension. So you're not shutting down the pension plan and rolling the assets out. You're just turning on the pension, and you're going to collect your monthly pension. The pension plan. Okay, so that's the condition. Now, what happens is this. If, let's say, the pension plan, thanks to that formula that I was telling you about, promises you, we'll use round numbers, $100,000 a year pension starting at age 65. Okay? But you decide as a doctor that you want to stop and you'd like to start collecting your pension, let's say at age 50. Okay? 15 years sooner.
So you can do it that early?
Yeah. You can do it at 40. There's no minimum age. So do you think that the pension plan will be able to pay you $100,000 if you start at age 50 instead of 65?
No.
It can't. There's no money. So what happens is you have what's called an actuarial reduction. So the actuaries figure out, okay, you want to start 15 years sooner? We're going to pay you $35,000 a year for the rest of your life, not 100. Okay. So that's the basic rule. And you hear about that, people retiring early on a reduced pension. Now, what terminal funding allows you to do is to slap on to the basic reduced pension, the one that's only allowing you $35,000 a year. You can layer what's called an early retirement subsidy pension and a temporary CPP bridge pension. So now what has happened is legally, the pension plan has agreed to pay you 3 pensions instead of 1, which means that instead of collecting $35,000 a year, you might be starting at $66,000 a year. You're not going to be at 100, but you're going to be way better than if you had done nothing and then you just collected your early retirement pension. The third enhancement is called full indexing.
Okay.
So that the $100,000 year pension, if inflation goes up 1%, then you get $101,000 a year pension the next year.
Okay.
So those are the three, what we call in pension jargon, we call them the ancillary benefits, which you can purchase through thermal funding. But who pays for that? Well, it has to be your professional corporation.
Okay.
And that's where you get a big, massive corporate tax deduction. And the largest thermal funding amount that I've ever seen, because I've seen thousands and thousands of these projections and illustrations, was over $2 million.
Okay, sorry, that's the amount that's being moved from the corp? Is that
just to do the thermal funding? Forget about all the other deductions. That's why I'm saying there's no comparison between an RRSP and a pension plan.
All right, those are some pretty big numbers and obviously providing a significant tax advantage. So thank you for providing that. Obviously helps to drive a few important points home. Now, benefits, we talked about a lot of benefits. So it's a great workaround for the passive income rules. We have increasing contributions. You've talked about terminal funding. Any contribution we make is a tax deduction. So investment fees. Now, my understanding is that investment fees inside an IPP are tax deductible, right? Whereas not so in an RRSP.
No, it's not prohibited by the Income Tax Act.
And then in terms of whatever is within that pension, it's going to grow like it would in an RRSP, tax sheltered, right?
Of course, yeah.
Now, maybe you can just touch on a few differences between the IPP and the RRSP in the sense that the RRSP does limit us from investing in certain instruments. Some things are not RRSP eligible. So what could an IPP offer there that an RRSP could not?
Yeah, so for example, private real estate, sure, you can invest through a REIT with your RRSP. And sometimes there's some private mutual funds, private real estate mutual fund trusts. But if I wanted to go buy some farmland for investment purposes, can't do that with an RRSP.
Right.
If I wanted to buy units of a limited partnership, not permitted by an RRSP. There's certain types of derivatives and certain other esoteric alternatives that are not RRSP eligible because they have liquidity issues. You know those Venn diagrams, the PPP investment world is much bigger than the RRSP world. It can do whatever an RRSP can, but it can do a lot more.
All right. So it sounds like some of the key differences, land, real estate, private equity, those are some of the big ones, right?
Mortgages secured on land, yeah.
Now, let's say you have an IPP going and let's say the returns, it's a bad year. Let's say you're not generating much or you're losing much. What happens there? I understand there are certain things that you can do to offset these declines.
Yeah, that's right. So the basic rule is that in order for the plan to continue to be fully funded, so there's enough money in retirement to pay the pension, the actuaries are supposed to assume that the assets are growing at 7.5%. So if you hit the 7.5% rate of return, then you're good. But if you underperform, let's say because of the stock market conditions or a bunch of bad decisions, you end up earning 2%, 3%, anything under 7.5%. What happens when the actuaries is called upon to do a evaluation of the plan? They will look at the liabilities that are growing thanks to the formula, and they look at the assets that are plummeting, and that creates underfunding. And it's that underfunding that the company is able to replenish with what we call special payments, additional tax-deductible contributions.
So essentially that basically promotes a buying on the dip mentality, right? Like let's say the markets are going down, you have a shortfall and you can replenish, you can put more money into the pension, right?
Well, let me give you a real life example of what happened. So on March 23rd of last year, the TSX lost about 36% and everybody was crying. Like people were saying, oh my God, I lost a third of my wealth. We were celebrating at Integris. And you're probably thinking, well, why on earth would they be celebrating? Because we told our clients, let's file a valuation report that shows the paper loss that you suffered. And now we can inject hundreds of thousands of dollars of fresh pre-tax dollars from your company to go buy the dip. Buy low, sell high. Except when you sell, the capital gain is free because it's a pension plan.
Oh my God.
As an extra bonus.
That almost sounds too good to be true. But listen, we are going to get into some disadvantages shortly. Okay. So let's say somebody goes through an event where someone's trying to come after your money. Is it safe inside an IPP, like creditor protection?
Yes, although I must, before December the 8th in Ontario, I would have said categorically yes. Now, what has happened is, and I don't want to get into too much technical, but the law now says that if you're a connected person, let's say you're a doctor and you own more than 10% of the shares of your professional corporation, which all doctors would typically, you're considered a connected person. If you file a pension plan for registration with CRA and you're connected, you're no longer caught by the Ontario Pension Benefits Act. And it's that statute that provided most of the creditor protection that we were used to over the decades that made pensions the most protected type of account in Canada. Mm-hmm. However, a pension plan doesn't have to be through a trust. It can also be with an insurance contract. So if you set up a pension plan and you're using an insurance company as the carrier to invest your assets, the Insurance Act of Ontario has a special rule that says that the money will continue to be creditor protected. So you can still have full creditor protection, but only if you use one of our insurance carriers.
That's good to know. And final thing about advantages of an IPP, I keep reading about income splitting, and I just wanted to know, to what extent is that possible? Is it possible up to 50% with just your spouse? Can you clarify this?
Yeah. So definitely it's possible. It can start at any age. Unlike the RIF where you have to be 65, mm-hmm. We could start you at 50, at 45, doesn't matter. So you have many more years where you can income split with your spouse, and it has to be a spouse.
Okay.
And it's up to 50%. So you don't have to allocate like half of your pension revenues to your spouse. Most people would, but technically you could say only 40% is moving to your tax return.
That sounds very powerful as well. But we have to look at some of the disadvantages. So costs. I guess I'm looking at setting up an IPP, annual filings, and I guess every 3 years you have to go through some actuarial filings, right? So just maybe sum up for us the costs and how much can we expect to pay per year?
Well, it depends on the provider. We don't do IPPs over at Integris, so all of this is anecdotal. We understand that some actuarial firms will charge a setup fee, others don't. Historically, before Integris joined the marketplace, pretty much all of them charge a setup fee. We, as a policy, scrapped those setup fees. So some of our competitors copied us and could not charge a setup fee anymore because we weren't charging a fee. They were only charging an annual fee. That annual fee varies. Some people can be fairly expensive, and some are very cheap. Some guys operating out of their basement. So I've seen it go as low as, I think, $700 a year, all the way up to about $4,000 a year. So that's the range for an IPP.
So once somebody has an IPP in place, it probably makes sense to focus on that rather than the RRSP. But let's say somebody still wanted to make spousal RRSP contributions. Is that possible at all with an IPP in place?
Well, the issue is this. When you start contributing to an IPP, you generate what's called a pension adjustment, or mm-hmm. PA. Mm-hmm. And these are toxic to your RRSP room.
Interesting.
So for every dollar of pension adjustment, you lose $1 of RRSP room. So it's difficult to then do spousal RRSP contributions because you've lost the room by having the pension plan in place.
Now, I talk to a lot of physicians who are DIY investors, and this is not, Jean-Pierre, this is not because we think we can beat portfolio managers, but a lot of us believe in low-cost ETFs, and I know a lot of people who put all their holdings in anywhere from one ETF to 3 ETFs. So let's say you're talking to somebody who's a professional and they want to invest in a single ETF like VGRO from Vanguard, just as an example. Is that possible within an IPP?
Yeah, because so long as the ETF meets the diversification test under the Pension Benefit Standards Act regulations,
Yep.
and I don't know that if that Vanguard fund does that, but I assume it does. Then you could put 100% of the capital of your IPP in that one security. Let's call it the units of that fund.
But what I understand is there are certain percentage rules where a certain percentage, or you can't exceed a certain percentage allocation. So I guess in what?
Before you go any further with that, that's true, but not if the underlying security that you're investing itself meets the diversification test. So normally, if I want to buy shares of RBC or GM or Apple, I can only put 10% of the shares of my IPP, or the value of my IPP into those particular securities.
Got it.
But that's because these are not diversified.
Gotcha. So you can't put more than 10% into RBC. You can't put more than 10% into CIBC, anything like that. Okay. I got it. So a lot of positives so far today, Jean-Pierre, but I mean, who should avoid an IPP? Can you give me an example of somebody who just would not be happy with the product?
Well, anybody under the age of 40, right? Because they'd be penalized in terms of the contribution room. And here I'm thinking, and this may not be for your listeners that are doctors, but anybody that's in business, if you have children on the payroll, you don't want them in an IPP because they would be penalized. And the fact that you can't put as much money as an RRSP or a PPP really has a real impact over the long run. The time value of money, of not having put as much money to work, is very, very significant over the long run.
That makes sense. Time for money to compound, and I totally get it. So last couple questions. Let's just say someone's coming to the end of their life and there's a surplus. We're always looking now at ways for kind of transferring funds from one generation to the next in a tax efficient manner. Does the IPP allow for that?
Well, if you have a spouse and you pass away, there is a spousal rollover. So the spouse will get your money without having to pay tax. The spouse will have to pay tax when the money's pulled out, either in the form of a pension or they roll it to the RRSP and then they pull out money of the RRSP. At that point in time, they'll pay taxes. But on the death, there's a rollover to the spouse.
So last question, if someone wanted to set up an IPP, you said at Integris you don't do these right now, but where would you go? How would you set one up?
Oh, everyone else does IPPs pretty much. There's lots and lots of the banks, some insurance companies, there's some independents. There's no shortage of IPP providers.
Okay, listen, Jean-Pierre, that I think is, a quick 30-minute overview of the IPP, but honestly, lots of useful information there. And I find this topic exciting. I know the PPP is going to be more exciting, but I find this one exciting as well because, in my opinion, we don't get told about these products probably as much as we should. I think there's probably a lot of advantages there. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today about the IPP. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, well, it's just fun. For me, it's second nature. It's what I do every day, all day long.
Yeah, I appreciate it. All right, let's establish a few take-home points on the individual pension plan, the IPP. So the basics, you have to be incorporated, you have to be paying yourself salary, only makes sense to enroll if you're at least 40 years of age. The main benefits, well, remember, the contributions to an IPP are going to exceed contributions possible to an RRSP once you're at least 40 years of age, and the gap between that contribution between the two is going to only increase as you get older. With the IPP, you can write off investment management fees, and you have access to different investment instruments, including private equity and real estate. Remember some of the special payments we talked about that are another tax deduction to the corporation, so terminal funding, and then top-up payments, those special payments if the IPP is performing at less than 7.5% gains per year. Also, don't forget about income splitting. It can happen anytime with your spouse, up to 50% of the income. And remember, it is tax-sheltered growth within the IPP. Now, all products come with some limitations, so remember, the IPP will not make sense when you're under 40 years of age. This is not going to be a product for somebody who's trying to knock it out of the park with one or two stocks or maybe a handful of stocks, again, to each their own, but it's due to the diversification criteria required within the IPP. And then obviously it's going to add some complexity to your life. More complex than an RRSP, there's going to be more paperwork, not the end of the world. Now, one thing I will mention is that IPPs used to be considered somewhat inflexible because there used to be a rule insisting that mandatory contributions had to be made every year into the plan to keep it intact. But fortunately, due to legislation put in place December 2020, that is not the case anymore. And then, as we talked about, there is a cost associated with IPPs. All right, so on cost, I mean, it's human nature, right, to not want to pay for things. This happens to everybody. And I think the best lesson that I can share is from my early teenage years. So I started golfing in my early teenage years, and we would frequently go out to Mont Tremblant. And our favorite place to stay was this little resort right beside Le Géant, so the golf course otherwise known as the Giant. And what I would do is in the evenings, I would actually walk down the trail that ran by the driving range, and I would find hundreds of lost balls in the woods. So I would scoop those up, and then the next morning I would take them back to the driving range and work on my game. You know, like, try not to judge me here. I mean, I was a 15-year-old Indian kid looking for a freebie, but one day the guy on the golf course, he saw what I was doing and he came over to me and he actually started to sing. And so, but the last line of his song, I mean, was a very practical message. He said, "Listen, kid, nothing is free in this world except sex." And I was just like, okay, but you know what? For what it's worth, IPPs aren't free either, but that should not stop us from learning about them and understanding the advantages that they can provide. So hopefully today was useful. If you like what you're hearing, feel free to download, subscribe, and spread the word. Hope you guys can join us next week when we talk about a slightly more elaborate pension plan. Yes, hard to believe it could possibly get better, but it's the PPP, the personal pension plan. So hope to see you guys next week. Until next time, stay safe, everyone. Stay savvy.